Cap Times Idea Fest 2020 is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors. Presenting sponsor, the Burrish Group at UBS, a financial services firm with global access and a local focus to pursue what matters most for its clients. Major sponsors are HealthX Ventures, backing entrepreneurs who are creating value with digital health solutions. Exact Sciences, pursuing earlier detections and life-changing answers in the fight against cancer. Quartz, health plans built with you in mind. And Madison Gas and Electric, your community energy company whose goal is net zero carbon electricity by 2050. Co-sponsors are Epic Systems and the Godfrey Kahn Law Firm. Other sponsors are Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, Home Savings Bank, Unity Point Health Meritor, Cargo Coffee, and the Forward Theater Company. Media partners are the Wisconsin State Journal and Madison.com, WKOW Channel 27, and Hinckley Productions. Please consider becoming a Cap Times member. Learn more at membership.captimes.com.
Hello, I'm Paul Fanland, editor and publisher of the Capital Times. I'd like to welcome you to this session of Cap Times Idea Fest about our future after a COVID-19 vaccine arrives. This is our fourth annual event, but the first we're presenting virtually. Our theme this year is 2020 Changes Everything. Given the local and regional impact of COVID-19, the resulting economic damage, and the impact of the Black Lives Matter movement, there's a lot to talk about. We think this year's lineup is our best yet. We believe Idea Fest has grown into a signature event on the Madison calendar. It is also an important showcase for the Capital Times, our locally owned and century-old journalism brand. If you're not already, we hope you'll consider becoming a Cap Times member. As a member, you'll have access to special Idea Fest programs plus benefits throughout the year. You'll also be supporting an independent and trustworthy local media source at a time when that has never been more important. Learn more at membership.captimes.com. I'd like to thank the Burrish Group at UBS, which is the presenting sponsor of Idea Fest and has been with us since the start. Andy Burrish and Jason Moss have built their asset management firm's stellar reputation by effective investing for Madisonians, but also for investing in Madison. Their generous support of Idea Fest is but one example of their community commitment. The session you're about to see is about what happens after a COVID-19 vaccine arrives and is sponsored by Unity Point Health Meritor. We're deeply grateful for them for their support. So please enjoy this session of Idea Fest. Thank you.
Hello, and welcome to Cap Times Idea Fest 2020, the year that changed everything. With me today are Dr. Nasia Safdar, the Vice Chair for Research at the University's Department of Medicine, the Medical Director for Infection Prevention at UW Health, and an infectious diseases physician. Also, we have Dr. James Conway, the Medical Director for Immunization Programs at UW Health, and of course, Malia Jones, a hybrid infectious disease epidemiologist and a social epidemiologist at UW-Madison. We'll be talking about what comes next after we do get a COVID-19 vaccine. Thanks to you all for being a part of this event. We really appreciate it. So before we get into vaccine questions, I wanted to lay a foundation for this conversation. In the past week, we've seen coronavirus cases in Wisconsin spike. A UW-Madison public health professor in a Wisconsin Public Radio report, likened what the state is seeing now to what New York was like in March. So Dr. Safdar, could you lay the groundwork for viewers of how the virus has spread across the state and, what we're currently seeing?
I think, if you start from the beginning back in March when we first started seeing cases here, we were able to effectively flatten the curve by putting into place some of the measures that help, such as the safer at home order. People started to really limit their physical mobility, wear masks, do aggressive hand hygiene, and stay home if they were sick. Now, these measures are necessary still, but I think over the last few months, there probably has been some fatigue setting in. People are less willing or able to do that. And so as a consequence, I think what we've seen is a sharp trajectory of most recently rising cases and on a direction to nowhere good. Our hospitalizations are perilously close to where we were back in April when we had a high of 45 in Dane County, for instance. And so I think it threatens the capacity of the health system, it threatens the healthcare worker workforce, and it threatens the health of the public. But having said that, because it was effectively able to be flattened back in March and April, we think it's possible to get back to that place, but action will have to be taken.
Yeah, so we did flatten the curve. I mean, so when did, things started going backward?
I would say in about the last month or so is when we started to see a rise. Some of it was, I think, also because much more activities are happening now. Some institutions have opened up, but I don't think there was one inciting event. The virus was circulating in our community. It was just kept at bay, and now it's sort of freed from its reins a little bit.
Yeah. Well, Malia, it's so good to see you. You were one of the last people I interviewed in person at the Cap Times' offices, which was, of course, back in March. You came in for a podcast reporting, and I just remember we had Lysoled everything, right?
Right.
So it's kind of crazy to be here months later, and in a whole new world, it seems like.
It does seem like that.
Yeah. I'm curious how you would gauge people's willingness to follow public health guidelines to curb infections, and I'm talking about, masks, like we're all of course wearing today, and limiting gatherings and interactions. And then I'm curious, what do you think that says about the willingness among the public to get a vaccine once it is available?
Mm-hmm. I think what we've seen happen over the course of the pandemic as it's rolled out in Wisconsin and elsewhere is that it is coming down to we're asking individuals to follow the public health guidelines that their local public health agencies are offering, and there's a lot of variation in what those recommendations are and what the requirements are. And it's really, I think, too much for individuals to parse all of the scientific information coming at them and then, make an appropriate decision one by one. And what would really help would be some state or national level guidance on what it takes and coordination at that level. And I hope that's what we see for vaccines when the vaccine becomes available as well.
Yeah, and it is so difficult because, of course, this is something brand new. So the science is, everyone is learning something new about this every day. And so, in addition to, there are different local guidelines, right? We're just learning more information. How do you think all of that changing information and changing guidelines, Dr. Safdar talked about fatigue. Does that sort of play into kind of the weariness that some are feeling with?
Yeah,
with this?
in fact, WHO coined this word not too long ago, the infodemic, which is meant to refer to the amount of information that we're all kind of swimming in and trying to evaluate and assess. And many of us don't have the scientific background or the time or even interest to parse all of it and figure out what's right and what's misinformation. And it's also changing constantly. So yeah, it's definitely contributing to the fatigue, even for me. And I that's what I do all day, every day. So
yeah, and as a reporter, I encounter new information all the time, and it's been a lot to wade through.
One of the interesting things is I think we're seeing science done in a fishbowl. I think that what we're used to is that something doesn't become established until it's been reproducible and done over and over again. And I think what we're seeing is, people are trying their best on the scientific side to put forth hypotheses and then see if they hold up. And then other people challenge those and do other experiments and do other modeling and say, maybe that one doesn't hold up. But for the public, or even for the scientists and the medical physicians, you almost see people getting whiplash because, this thing says this and then somebody else says that. And only once you get these things reproduced does it actually become, okay, this is really what we should be doing. And we've never seen that before. I don't think we've ever had something like this where the internet and social media was spilling these things out for people to digest as quickly as they have to. And so it's been really hard for people to say, this is the person I trust or this is the group I trust, because even those groups periodically say, this is the best we know today. A couple days later, they know something different, and you get into the situation we're in.
Yeah, there's this divide between transparency and trying to present all information to the public, but then is that too much? I think that's an interesting question to consider. Dr. Conway, I think it'd be helpful for viewers just to understand, how vaccines are typically developed and then what is currently occurring with Operation Warp Speed. Could you kind of walk everyone through that a bit so we're sort of, coming with the same information to this talk?
Sure. So, if you think about the typical way a drug or a vaccine is developed, people keep hearing about these phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4 studies. And really that's the paradigm that we use for the development of any medical product. So phase 1 is really working out what's the right dose, does it actually do what it claims to do, and is it safe as we figure out that dosing. Phase 2 is where you do, usually hundreds of people, and you get much better sense for, does it actually drive the immune response you want, and is the dose that you've selected really the dose that's going to work. And then phase 3 is where you actually get out into large-scale studies where you're doing thousands or tens of thousands of people, and you're really getting a sense for the rarer side effects that might occur. If you look at 30 or 40,000 people, that's where you start to see the 1 in 10,000 side effect, or the 1 in 20,000. And you start to get then a sense of, does it actually work? The problem with vaccines is that there's two ways we think about how they actually work to prove it, are they actually effective. One is we use the actual disease and the incidence of the disease in people that have received the vaccine and saying, are they getting the disease or not, because if they got the vaccine or not. The other is what we call surrogate markers of immunity, where we measure things like antibodies to say, does the vaccine even stimulate your immunity? And so I think people have gotten excited about things because they keep hearing about various vaccines that do cause immunity and do cause antibodies to be formed. The problem is that coronaviruses have been around and are always around and cause colds and everything all the time. About 60% of kids and probably 90% of adults carry coronavirus antibodies, and yet people can get infected over and over again. And the problem then is that coronaviruses don't by themselves usually give people great immunity. And so the problem when we're trying to develop a vaccine is essentially we're trying to develop a vaccine that's better than our own immune responses to normal coronaviruses as we face these things on a regular basis. So that's sort of the problem we're faced with and kind of how these things work. But usually these things are done in a very stepwise fashion. We often say, just as a back of the envelope, only about 1 in 100 vaccines as it's being created and tested ever actually makes it to the market. And it usually takes 8 to 10 years to kind of go through that whole process. What we're asking and what we're trying to do is essentially to speed that up by stacking these things and doing a lot of them at the same time. So at the same time that we're doing phase 1 and 2 trials or phase 2 and 3 trials, they're also then starting to mass manufacture vaccines just in case, so that whenever one of them seems to be promising enough, it's already going to be ready to go. And I think the hard part for people to grasp on the medical side is we've been doing it the same way for so long. Is it okay and is it safe to do it in a sped up way? And I think a lot of us were a little bit concerned or skeptical in the beginning. And I think more and more we've actually been reassured that with all the voices in the conversation that are pushing and pulling about how fast is too fast and what's the safety measures that we need to keep, I think people have become much more comfortable on the medical side that the right people are actually at the table and are driving the conversation to say, look, we can do it faster. We are not going to compromise on our safety standards by one bit, but we can actually do this in a much more efficient way as long as there's a lot of money put into it. And that's basically what Operation Warp Speed is $10 billion being put into making all these things happen all at the same time. So I think we've gone from being quizzical and maybe even skeptical to being a little bit more reassured and almost optimistic that this is actually happening in an acceptable way because all the right voices and the scientists are being allowed to go forward the way they usually do.
Is that a similar sentiment for you both?
Yeah, it's similar for me. When we started talking about a vaccine and the vaccine development timeline, I think the fastest we ever developed a new vaccine previously was 5 or 8 years or something like that. And so I was really very skeptical that we would be able to get a effective vaccine through all the phases of a vaccine trial to identify whether it was safe and effective in a few months essentially. But it looks like that is what is happening. And so, yeah, I am reassured that this timeline could produce the vaccine that has been effectively tested.
Yeah, I would say the same. I think I shared your earlier skepticism, Jim, when you mentioned, it was so unlike anything that had ever been done before that I think everyone wondered, can it really be pulled off? But I think things have been going rather well in that regard, and so I'm optimistic as well.
Well, what determines if a trial is successful? And ultimately, how do you know if a vaccine is working?
Yeah, the ultimate bottom line is, does it protect people from the disease, and does it by no means make the disease worse than it would have been? And I think those are really the two key parts of it. One of the things that you have to think about is in some medical trials, they will intentionally challenge people with the organism to see if it actually causes disease. That's usually done in an ethical way only when there's an actual treatment available. And since we've never really hit on the treatment for this disease, instead the way this is happening is really letting the real world part of it actually unfold. And so most of these trials are being done where people are given their doses of their vaccines and then essentially encouraged to live their normal lives. Now that normal life includes all of this that we're doing, social distancing and hand washing and all that kind of stuff to diminish our exposure. And so that's part of the reason that some of the early optimism where people were talking about, oh, we'll have this in October or whatever, it just doesn't work that way because, a lot of these people that are being vaccinated are also taking all these other measures to try to be careful. So we basically just have to wait until enough people in the trials come down with COVID-19, and then they will eventually, when they reach a certain threshold, unblind the trial and see who got it. Did the people in the placebo arm of the trial get it, or did people that actually got the vaccine get sick anyway? And that's really when these vaccine trials will essentially be stopped, is when enough people in the trial have gotten sick and diagnosed with the disease. And we have thresholds that epidemiologists and statisticians help work out, like what is that number? But essentially, once enough people get sick that are in the trial, that'll be the time that we stop the trial and say, okay, how'd the vaccine hold up and how did it do?
Yeah, well, the New York Times has this great, vaccine tracker, so you can, follow how many are in the works right now. But a question for anyone, just about how many are going on right now, and are there any in particular that are, interesting to you, or possibly farther along in this phase trial process that you talked about?
Well, there's 149 in the preclinical that are kind of been, animal and lab things, and then depending on which day you look, there's 30 something that are in phase 1, 2, or 3. I think that the phase 3 ones are the ones that people should be looking at as the furthest along. AstraZeneca, the Oxford vaccine, was the one that was the furthest along because it came out of the gate already having been tried for other diseases in the past. That's the one that's been suspended in its trials currently as they're trying to assess some safety stuff. And to be honest, I think that's a really good sign that the system is really a pretty high fidelity system. Like a couple of cases of some stuff that are concerning is enough to shut it all down and say we need to understand those before we move forward. I think people should be extraordinarily reassured by that. The other ones that are coming along a little bit behind but marching along quite nicely are based on this mRNA platform that's never been used before for any other vaccine ever, but seem to be quite promising and making nice progress, seem to be quite safe. And so I think those are the ones that we're going to likely see, coming to market in the United States in the earliest period of time. People are hearing about all these vaccines worldwide. The Chinese and the Russians are using an adenovirus-based vaccine, which is a virus that circulates routinely and humans get infected with routinely. And so they'd use sort of a platform that had been established before to quickly sort of push something into phase 3 trials and are using those. I don't think those are going to be a great answer, but ultimately I think we're going to end up with something that looks like what we see with flu. We're going to have a whole bunch of different types of vaccines to be able to have enough of them available. And people are going to have to get the same vaccine that they started with probably to really make sure they work because they're also very different. But which ones ends up being the ones that are available initially and then which ones sort of follow along. There's so many twists and turns along the path for a vaccine to come to the point where it's available to the public. It's hard to predict which horse is going to win this race, but it's almost like thinking that, as long as they cross the finish line, they're all winners at some point. And I think that's the way we need to think about this.
And I think just to layer onto that, we might also see, those ones that are currently in phase 3 trials are likely to be available first because they're closest to being approved, but there may be one that's more effective that comes along later. And so there might actually be a series of different vaccines that with varying effectiveness and approved in different populations.
Yeah, that's a great point. Ultimately, the best vaccine may be years out and may take the more traditional timeline to be developed. And so I think that people should kind of look at this as phases. Like, we're not going to be able to stop doing all of this stuff for a while because even when vaccines come along, I think that what we're seeing at these initial ones and sort of hoping is that they'll at least be 60 or 70% effective, so that'll mean that some people that get vaccinated might still get the disease or might hopefully get milder versions of the disease. But it's not going to be like somebody switches a switch and all of a sudden everything's back to normal. I think it's going to be a gradual process as we march through this. Initially just having enough of them to even immunize people, but then we're going to have to see how long they last, and how many more doses. Do people have to get it every year like the flu? These are all things to be determined still.
Definitely. One thing I've been thinking about is, this is a competitive process, right? One company wants to be the one to come out with this vaccine. I'm interested, do you think that in the science and in the research community that there's also sort of a sense of pulling together and collaboration and, wanting this sense of wanting to, come up with the vaccine so that we can, start, moving ahead and kind of knocking this virus out?
I would say I think the collaboration in the scientific community for this pandemic is really unprecedented. People from all over the world have come together to share data, to learn from each other. Just the speed of information, as you were mentioning, Jim, I think has been pretty amazing and really good to see. Having said that, I think there's also the threat then of misinformation and how much can you trust what type of information, I think, which one has to weed through. But from the scientific perspective, I think we've learned more about this pandemic in the few months that we've been dealing with it than we have with really any other major infectious condition in the past.
Yeah, I would just echo, I have never seen the scientific process happen anything like the way it is happening right now. A lot of, Jim was mentioning the public and journalists, and we're all faced with this issue of preprints coming out. As soon as someone has some results to share, a preprint paper comes out, and that's essentially it hasn't completed the scientific process of being vetted. And what we're seeing happen is it gets peer reviewed on Twitter pretty much instantaneously. It's really remarkable. It's very, very fast, and also I think very collaborative kind of effort. And in terms of vaccine development, of course, these companies have invested tremendous resources in developing the vaccine. But I think that in general, the scientific process is collaborative. It is interdisciplinary and collaborative across institutions. And so I think that even with the vaccine trials, we're seeing collaboration.
While we're on the topic of collaboration and information, you actually with some others started something called Dear Pandemic. I just wanted to ask you to share that a bit with our viewers, what that is.
Yeah. So early on in the pandemic, I kind of accidentally got a lot of attention for my views on what was happening, just as someone who works in a related field. In normal times, I study vaccine hesitancy. So now that we're approaching getting a vaccine, I'm a little bit back more in my wheelhouse. But early on, I got a lot of attention from the public for a message that I sent out about what I saw going on. And that kind of morphed into this interdisciplinary collaboration that I am involved in called Dear Pandemic. And we're a group of 12 female scientists with PhDs and MDs. And we post information that's intended for the general public to help navigate the misinformation and the overwhelm of information.
Yeah, have you found there's an appetite for what you guys are doing?
Oh, absolutely. It grows every day, and our following, in 6 months we have on Facebook. I think we are up to about 35,000 followers, and
that sounds
each
impressive.
post we post twice a day, and each one seems to get more reach than the last. So there's definitely an appetite for it.
Yeah, very cool. Well, I wanted to talk about a timeline. I think that is the biggest question people want to know is when will there be a vaccine, among other questions. But, what do we know about this right now? And do you all have, some educated guesses about sort of a likely timeline for when a vaccine might be available for the public?
Yeah, the magic 8 ball says ask again later.
Yeah.
I think
my jokey reply to this is sometime between next week and 2022.
Right.
Perfect.
The reason we joke about this is it is very unpredictable at so many levels. One is just how does the science itself work out, and when do cases occur in enough people that you even get to the point where you have preliminary data, and then is that data actually suggest that the vaccine is good enough to move it forward? So those are pretty ginormous ifs. And so there's a lot of wild cards in there, including a lot of these studies started in the Northeast, where then they did a great job getting this under control. And so all of a sudden there was less disease circulation, and a lot of immunized people are then walking around and not getting sick. And nobody knows, is it because there's no disease around, or is it because the vaccine is awesome? So, that part is there. And so we're gonna have to wait until the data, even suggests what this is gonna represent as far as efficacy, then there's going to be a period of time where people are going to need to watch for a while and make sure that these things don't have any, short and long-term side effects. And then basically the big part that's going to have to happen is deciding whether this goes through the traditional FDA approval process or whether the companies essentially ask for emergency use authorization. And so that really changes the whole dynamic of how long this may take to really come to fruition. Then you get to the part of how many doses of whatever vaccines are first available, how many of those doses have already been made, and how do those get shipped. And I think one of the things that Dr. Safdar and I are starting to deal with is some of these vaccines, because they're completely novel science, have really, really rigorous storage and transportation requirements, using like freezers at minus 80 degrees Celsius that are not the normal for what most vaccines need. So at the same time that, we're talking about all this stuff, we're also talking about like, how do we find the infrastructure and build up the ability to do this? How do you deliver these in a rapid period of time? So, I do think that there will be some vaccines available certainly by early 2021. How many and what populations those are ready for, it's hard to predict. I think health workers are likely to be the first ones, partially because they're on the front line and partially because they're probably a little bit more willing to take some of the potential risks of continuing to be part of a study. But beyond that, it's really hard to predict what this looks like as it keeps unfolding.
I think the other thing that's completely outside our control is the hiccups that will happen, if there's an adverse event and it needs a review. I mean, we're seeing that with one of the existing vaccine trials that has been on hold now for several weeks. So I think that setting something out in a timeline really only works when you can completely control every step of it, and when you can't, then you have this estimate and then a large range around that estimate, which I think is what you were mentioning.
The continued uncertainty here is one of the things that's reassuring. I mean, it doesn't look like it's just being rammed through. We can't know because we can't know how long it's going to take to actually complete the studies that will give us information about the safety.
It is interesting because obviously there's a political piece of this where people have been, cheerleading to try to get a vaccine. And I think one of the things that we've become increasingly reassured by is that the pharmaceutical companies and the FDA officials and so many other people in science and public health have basically just agreed this has just got to go through the process that it goes through. And while we may be intent on trying to speed it up for all of us, there's really no way it can be politically pushed forward. I think the agreements on how emergency use authorization is going to look, even if the companies ask for it, really still falls in line with like the traditional routine safety checks and balances that have been developed all these years. And so I do feel very confident that the system will work on behalf of all of us. But your question is a great one, but we just don't know what all these unknowns are and what speed bumps and barriers may pop up along the way. It's going to happen. It's just a matter of how many of them and how often.
Well, and of course, if any of us could have predicted the future, we would have predicted what's going on right now and maybe taken some other steps to prepare for that. I'm sorry, go ahead, Malia.
I was just going to add one other dimension to the how long until we get a vaccine is, when a vaccine is approved, I mean, you alluded to this, but when a vaccine is approved, it won't just be available to everyone immediately. There's going to be a tiered rollout, and it will probably take quite a while even after approval before it's available to the general public.
Yeah, the logistics of this, I mean, I think people really need to understand, like the scientific development is one piece, but the logistics, think about this. So, in the United States, we have 330 million people. We get about 42% of the population immunized with flu vaccine every year. And, that's a pretty intensive push over a 3, 4, or 5 month period to get people immunized. The companies that basically make about 200 million doses of vaccine. We're essentially asking for a lot of unprecedented activity to all come together just so, including, most of these vaccines look like they'll need multiple doses. So it's not 330 million doses, it's probably 660 million doses. And getting those all into people with all these other, storage and transportation issues, there's a lot of pieces that have to fall into place just so. So I think Malia is absolutely right. This is going to be sort of coming out, even once it's ready, we're going to see this coming in waves, and there's going to be continued change. And the other thing I wanted to mention that you alluded to is, there's a lot of information out there, but I've actually been pretty impressed that the public is really thirsty for information. And part of the reason Dear Pandemic has become so popular is that people are constantly looking for trustworthy people that they can rely on that seem to be consistently able to help interpret for them. And you know, I do really encourage people to be educated and to learn about these things, but you do have to be cautious about the sources that you look to. And that's, I think, really challenging. But I'm hopeful that as people become more versed in how to do this and where they're going to do this, that as we keep developing and having information to share, that people are gradually getting used to both the fact that it may change periodically and sort of sources that they find to be consistent and trustworthy.
Well, I'm glad you sort of transitioned into the distribution aspect of things, because that's a question that I have been hearing is, you know, just when a vaccine is ready, you know, is it going to be something, you know, people can go to their local pharmacy and get it like a flu shot? And what I'm hearing from you all is that's likely, you know, not the case, that it might, you know, come in waves and perhaps people need multiple doses, kind of like a booster shot. I mean, anything else that, you know, we know of right now of how this distribution process might look like?
I think the cold chain issue that you mentioned, you know, is a really critical one, because you could think about having a decentralized distribution model where any place that is capable of delivering it to patients and the public would be able to store it. But not many places have the capability to do a cold chain and to maintain custody of that to make sure the vaccine is stored correctly. And of course, they can't compromise on that. So I think if that's the case, then it limits the places that can effectively store and manage and distribute the vaccine. And it's important for this country, no doubt, but it's absolutely critical for other places around the world that have even fewer resources to contend with. So I think that will have major implications of distribution.
Yeah, there certainly are groups that are working on more temperature stable vaccines and vaccines that may not require ultra cold, as we call it. But those are probably some years out. I mean, those are technologies that people have, you know, worked on for many decades and have had limited success. So, you know, I think one of the great things is this is an all hands on deck effort. I think we're going to see, you know, similar to the moonshot and things like that, I think we're going to see scientific discoveries that are going to have ripples for decades and probably generations coming from, you know, recognizing the imperative of this pandemic and the threat it represents, and, you know, seeing how much money and how much effort and how much collaboration is happening. I think there's going to be, you know, extraordinary discoveries that come from this entire process that, you know, certainly in my field in vaccinology and immunizations, you know, is probably going to revolutionize both the domestic and the international distribution and availability of vaccines, and, you know, give us a lot of opportunities to improve things.
Great. Well, we are going to take a quick break before moving on to more discussion about a coronavirus vaccine and what comes next.
Cap Times Idea Fest 2020 is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors. Presenting sponsor, the Burrish Group at UBS, a financial services firm with global access and a local focus to pursue what matters most for its clients. Major sponsors are HealthX Ventures, backing entrepreneurs who are creating value with digital health solutions. Exact Sciences, pursuing earlier detections and life-changing answers in the fight against cancer. Quartz, health plans built with you in mind. And Madison Gas and Electric, your community energy company whose goal is net zero carbon electricity by 2050. Co-sponsors are Epic Systems and the Godfrey Kahn Law Firm. Other sponsors are Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, Home Savings Bank, Unity Point Health Meritor, Cargo Coffee, and the Forward Theater Company. Media partners are the Wisconsin State Journal and Madison.com, WKOW Channel 27, and Hinckley Productions. Please consider becoming a Cap Times member. Learn more at membership.captimes.com.
Welcome back, everyone. Before the break, we were talking about distribution of a vaccine. And, you know, I'm curious, how do we think ethically and epidemiologically about how to distribute a vaccine? It's kind of a big question. Anyone can jump in there.
Yeah, I wanted to follow on at the end of the last segment. Jim was talking about distribution. And, you know, from a logistical perspective, but then we also have this, there will be priority population groups for getting the vaccine. And we know already that the highest priority group will be healthcare workers and first responders. And then there's actually several different official documents that have recommendations for who should be in the sort of next phase for priority, and that includes people who are really particularly high risk. If they were to get COVID-19 because of their other health conditions, it includes age groups and also highly impacted subpopulations like African Americans and Native Americans.
Yeah, there was an interesting study that came out a couple of days ago that polled Americans on kind of how they thought this should go, and I was interested in, 91% said they thought healthcare workers should be the first wave, and interesting, like 81% thought that older individuals over age 65 and children should be the next. And I think one of the realities that people need to understand is that children haven't even been involved in any of the studies yet. When we're talking about those phase 1, 2, and 3 studies, the initial larger groups tend to be, people 18 to 45 or 18 to 55 who are healthy. And only once you can absolutely show that there's safety in a healthy population do you start doing people with comorbidities, older people and people with medical conditions. But in general, the last group of people that are studied when you're talking about a vaccine are pregnant women and children, because people want to be absolutely sure that it's safe in all these other populations. And yet it was interesting to me that so many Americans basically said that they think children should be an early priority. Now, it makes perfect sense because everybody wants their kids back in school and they want, some version of life to be able to go back to normal. But I think that does require a different level of risk tolerance. And, the companies that are making these vaccines and the scientists are really rapidly trying to figure out a way to do that in a way that does ethically make sense and is safe, because everybody, I think, really agrees that that is an important part of getting society back to being something more normal.
One of the highest priority, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say one of the highest priority groups listed in the recent National Academy of Medicine document is teachers. So that would be one step along the path to getting kids back to school.
I think the first group, and the first few groups would have to be those that they receive the vaccine in the trials, that are represented in there. I don't think the people making and marketing the vaccines would really be able to say that other groups can get it if they weren't there. So having said that, children will likely be one of the last groups then.
Right, and so in realizing that, I think that's why people have suddenly, pivoted and said, like, well, we need to start some children's studies. And so the FDA has basically sort of said, 12 to 17-year-olds would be a sort of a reasonable group. They're kind of small adults. They're certainly not going through as much of their neurodevelopmental, important growth as a younger kid, as at least a beginning of a way to step into that. But it is going to be, challenging. I mean, obviously, you're going to need parents to be willing and to consent to have their kids in those kind of studies to really see if these things work well. Historically, there have been a couple of occasions where vaccines weren't tested particularly in a population and yet were recommended. The one that comes to mind is the Tdap vaccine, for pertussis and tetanus, that was tested in healthy adults, but when we realized that little babies get whooping cough and the best way to protect them is to give their mothers that vaccine, that even though there hadn't been large trials in pregnant women, people had enough of a track record of safety, and some pregnant women had been inadvertently immunized enough that people said, like, this is a reasonable recommendation. So, it's not that it's unprecedented. I think we could get to a point where there's a way of getting into children without having to go through these large-scale, massive trials to do so.
As we get, of course, this is all thinking into the future, but as we, have a vaccine and it is rolled out, and kind of thinking down the line, what role do you think perhaps public health departments or, the healthcare system as a whole, have to play in making sure that communities who might have been traditionally sort of disconnected from the healthcare system, or harmed by it, make sure that, they have the knowledge they need and the access to the vaccine?
Well, one of the really concerning factors that's at play right now is that when we survey a sample of people and ask them if they'd be willing to get the COVID-19 vaccine when it comes out, people in general actually say that they will, but some subgroups are much more likely to say that they will not. And those subgroups include both African Americans and Native Americans, and those are also both groups that are really high risk for negative outcomes. And so I think that there's a real need to build trust and be transparent about the risks and the benefits of the vaccine with those groups in particular. And that's work that we can start doing in public health now to try and build up those ties and make sure that subgroups that are at particular risk of being vaccine hesitant and also particular risk of COVID-19 we have the buy-in to get the vaccine to those groups.
Definitely, yeah, and that work has to begin now as we look toward one.
And I think what would help to build trust is also what's happening now, which is this concerted effort to make sure that those populations also participate in the trials and have an opportunity very early on to learn about what it means or not mean to participate in research and what sort of risks and benefits you might expect and what you're contributing to in terms of learning more about how it works in all subgroups. And so I think that's been really at the forefront of people that have been leading these vaccine trials, which has been good to see.
Good and unusual. I mean, that's not traditionally how drug trials have worked, and so.
Yeah, I mean, traditionally drug trials are 18 to 45-year-old healthy males. I mean, nobody wants to mess with a woman who potentially may get pregnant and when you're testing a drug or something. That's just been how it's worked, and it has been, largely educated white populations have been the ones that sign up for those trials. And I think both of my colleagues are correct. Like, there hasn't been traditionally a lot of outreach and a lot of effort to engage and involve a lot of these other populations. And, I think it's unfortunate because, it's a continually cycling problem then of distrust. And I think it does need a lot of effort to start to heal these wounds and start to repair things that have happened for many, many, many decades.
And it's going to be really necessary from an epi perspective too, because it's thought that we'll need something like 60 or 70% of people to be immune in order to get herd immunity and just stop an outbreak, stop the outbreak from being able to continue spreading. And if we get a vaccine that's only maybe 50 or 60% effective, or it will prevent someone who is exposed to COVID-19 from coming down with it 50 or 60% of the time, then we basically need everybody to get the vaccine. And so we really do need to get buy-in from all groups, and particularly the ones that are at highest risk.
But I think Nasia said the most important thing is then those populations need to be engaged and involved in the studies from the very beginning. And at least I think, we live in such interesting times and such challenging times, but at least that has become part of the routine conversation that, most of the vaccines, at least 25% of their population in the vaccine trial are of certain age groups, and they are accepting, people with comorbidities, but also reaching out and doing, engagement with a lot of these other populations. I think this is the way it should have always been, and so this is what I keep saying is that, while this is all unfortunate and terrible, there are silver linings within all this that, this may revolutionize how we do all this. And maybe from the beginning, all drugs and vaccines will be tested routinely in a more representative population than they have been in the past.
Well, in terms of vaccine hesitancy and thinking about a timeline for a vaccine, what challenges exist with possibly putting out a vaccine too soon, or even if it's just as perceived as too soon? But thinking about the interplay between those two things.
I'm really concerned about the political polarization of what should be just basic science, basic public health issues. We've seen how polarizing the issue of wearing masks has become, and that is a real public health threat. I mean, that's a real public health problem. And I think that there's some risk that if there's perception that the vaccine has come out, especially before the election in November, which I think is actually just very unlikely. But if it did, then I think that we might get all tangled up in those political and polarization issues in the vaccine, and that would be a real loss for public health.
I think we have to approach this. I completely agree with you. I think we have to approach this very carefully because, people are healthy. They're not feeling sick right now for the ones that haven't contracted COVID-19. So we're convincing a healthy population to take something that if they're not entirely convinced is in their best interest, why would they? And they won't be convinced in their best interest if there's any perception, whether it's true or not, that any corners were cut or that it was politicized or that something was done that was outside of accepted scientific practice. So which is why I think that some of the individuals and companies manufacturing the vaccines are now very aware and cognizant of that and have taken steps to reassure the public. I mean, reputation is everything, and a single misstep in this direction could mean that a perfectly good vaccine is dead forever.
Yeah, I think both FDA and CDC, I think we've seen, have, for the first time in my lifetime, become groups where people, even in our shoes, question some of the things that come out. And, a lot of it, again, is this whiplash of just new data and seeming to, kind of retool their messaging and stuff like that. But there has been, clearly, as we're all aware in the media, some issues with the types of messaging or with the reasoning behind their messaging. And so I think that, we're going to have to start rebuilding that trust immediately, in many different ways. And I think it's as much a challenge as developing a vaccine itself, is getting people to trust and understand that, public health is here for them, and figuring out a way to sort of reestablish that baseline trust that we've always depended on.
And I think there are so many examples in history of prior vaccines where there's clear differences between, who's leading the effort to convince the public. If it's politics, it almost invariably fails, and if it's scientists, then it usually goes reasonably well because there's no hidden agendas that people have to worry about. So I think we know how to do that, and the question is, will it be done that way?
Or will we be given the space to do it in the way? I mean, that's why I give you guys credit that, groups like yours are trying to at least talk to the people that, seem to know kind of what's best for us and for the public, and, sort of have everybody's best interests in mind. And, I think we all hope that that'll be something that kind of reveals itself soon, that FDA and CDC in general really do have that same priority, but, need to work on clarifying their messaging and be clear about why and what it is that we need to be doing.
And just getting the political ideology out of the public health message. I mean, it's, public health is a science. Science is not progressive or conservative. It's just science. And so I think we've got the cart before the horse when we are in this situation where some of our leaders are, have an ideological perspective on the science and are filtering it for us, and saying things like, not requiring masks when it's clear that requiring everyone to wear a mask would be good for public health. It doesn't need to be ideological.
Well, I think we've seen, how swiftly, things like wearing a face mask, just the coronavirus in general, has become political. And of course, we're in an election year. The election is right around the corner. And I guess in thinking ahead to a vaccine, do you think we, as a society here, can sort of roll back from the politicization that has happened so far? And if so, do you have any ideas for how to do that?
Don't look at me.
Answer that.
I mean, I think anything's possible. I mean, I've been around long enough to see that I do have faith in mankind and faith in our country that we can figure out things despite great challenges. But this is going to be a bit of a Herculean effort to, essentially, turn back time. But, I think the majority of people and the majority of the people in public health, recognize that. I think in some ways, people are sort of biding their time to kind of wait till the election dust settles and then sort of see where we are and kind of hit reset, regardless of which way it goes, just to, sort of hit reset. But I do think that there's a lot of effort that's going to need to go into understanding what the public needs to hear about and wants to hear about and how they want to hear about it and meeting them where they are. I think that's where Malia and others have been really sort of exploring, like, how does scientific literacy and health-seeking behavior intersect, and where's the best place for those things to happen?
So to the rest of you, are there any other ways that you think we can roll back from how politicized things have become with the coronavirus?
Well, I think, the main things that I think about when I'm thinking about depoliticizing things is that there needs to be consistent messaging and there needs to be humility with the recognition that some things are left to science and some are left to public health and some are left to a combination of the two. So I think if that piece could be done, then I think that there may be hope for us all. I do think that a critical piece of the whole vaccine movement is this perceived hazard by the public. And as we know, some in leadership have been downplaying the hazard of this virus. And as long as the public perceives there's no hazard, then why on earth would anybody be interested in taking a vaccine? So inaccuracies in those kind of key messages, I think, can be long-lasting and can really hurt the public for a while.
One of the things that I've been thinking about, and I was thinking about last night, was, one of the mistakes I think that's happened along the way is when a significant amount of information comes along that means we need to change a policy, I think there needs to be a more loud acknowledgement that there's been a change and that we acknowledge, so Fauci is the classic example. Like in the beginning, he did say masks don't really seem to be that necessary. And when the data started to become clearer that they really were important, I think that the statements that came out should have included, we know we said that you don't need masks, but that was incorrect. Here's what we know now. Instead, it was sort of like, here's this week's message, and everybody was left sort of scratching their head and like, wait, didn't we hear something different? I think a better acknowledgement and an understanding, like this is how science works. Like the more we find out, the more we know, and we can keep tweaking things. But I think that the public would appreciate people acknowledging, like, you're not crazy. You did hear what you think you heard. It's just that now we know more and it's different.
This is one of the core missions of Dear Pandemic, is to try, so we do a few things. One is just, be a reliable source of scientifically grounded information that's also very practical. But another thing we do is try to improve people's scientific literacy so that they can actually navigate those kinds of back and forth and what's happening in this rapidly unfolding body of knowledge and understand it a little bit better and be better equipped to roll with the punches as things change. And one of the things that I have really felt strongly about from the beginning of that communications effort is, when we have said something incorrect, we just say, we were wrong. We have new information now. This is the latest. And do that unapologetically, because that is the scientific process. That's how it works.
Definitely. Malia, this might be a question for you, but anyone else, feel free to chime in. I'm curious how you might think sort of the anti-vaccine movement here might affect the overall public acceptance of a vaccine. Of course, some people just believe that any vaccine they're not going to take, and so now with this new one coming out, if you could just sort of walk us through your thoughts on how those two pieces work together.
Yeah, we have seen a really interesting alignment of people who feel strongly that vaccines are unsafe and vaccine conspiracy theory, which tends to be a very far left political ideology, and very, very conservative political ideologies who are also kind of pushing back on some of this science. And it's hard to predict what the future is going to look like. I think in part because our assessment of the hazards is always evolving. And so, there was a study very early on that suggested that only half of Americans would take the vaccine, but that's gone up to like 80%. And I think part of what's changed there is that we're all just more familiar with the hazards. As more and more of us know someone who's had COVID-19 or died of it, our assessment of those hazards goes up. And so it's an evolving situation. So, but that said, like I said before, we're going to need pretty thorough coverage of a vaccine in order to achieve herd immunity and really get control of the outbreak. And so if there's a substantial fraction of people who just refuse to take it, then that'll be a challenge to getting the outbreak under control on a long-term basis.
Definitely. This pandemic has been with us for months now, and I think there's a feeling, that once a vaccine exists, then things can go back to normal, right? Our lives can kind of start back over to how things were. And Dr. Safdar, when we spoke on the phone, you said we can't pin our hopes and dreams to a vaccine, and that, there are other things that we might have to do. And so I guess my question for you and for all of you is, how effective might a vaccine be, and what else will our community have to do to eliminate the virus?
I think to go back to what Jim was saying earlier on, even if we do get a vaccine that's effective, it's not like some kind of switch will be flipped and it's not here today and it'll be here tomorrow and everyone will be protected. It's going to be a long, drawn-out process, probably going in concentric circles of individuals that need it, healthcare workers, and then the susceptible, vulnerable older adults, and then so on. So we're looking at a considerable stretch of time between now and when the public will have first access and then be able to get the vaccine. So I don't think that masking or physical distancing or hand washing or limiting non-essential activities will be ready to go away for a long time. It may even be the case that even in the presence of the vaccine, you still wouldn't want to pack conference rooms with people like we used to do before for medical conferences or shake hands. I think some of those behaviors are likely going to go away for the long term. But on the other hand, our memories are short, so I guess it depends. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah, it is interesting. Our memories are short. If you think about influenza as sort of a parallel, somehow as a society, we've been okay with, on an average year, 20 or 30 million cases of influenza and 200,000 or 300,000 hospitalizations and, 20 or 30,000 deaths. And, that's just kind of been part of what we've, as a society, accepted. And, there's years where it's worse, where we have 50 or 60,000 deaths. And, that's an acceptable level to be able to have the social lives that we've all had. What we've seen in communities and in countries where social distancing has been really embraced, Australia during their winter essentially had no flu season. It just went away and it was gone. And, I think maybe as a society, depending on where we normalize with all this, we may end up at a place that's not quite back to where we were, where people are just a little bit more careful or expected to be a little bit more careful. And maybe as a whole society, then we just become a better society, that there's less disease circulating in general. And the cold and flu season that is pretty inconvenient and devastating for some people, maybe we can figure out a way to tamp it down consistently. So maybe there is some silver lining that, we back down to something resembling more normal, but we never go to completely, freewheeling the way we were. It's a little sad at some level, but in fact, maybe it's a whole social responsibility contract that we all need to kind of reconsider where we were and where we want to be.
I think it would be a huge public health win if one of the outcomes of all of this is that it is no longer normative or acceptable to show up at work kind of sick, right? Especially in the flu season. I mean, that would be a huge public health win, even if COVID-19 magically went away.
Huge. And everybody does it. I mean, doctors and nurses, there was a survey a couple of years ago, like they're the worst. I mean, we've all gone to work sick and we think we're being heroes. In fact, we're being inconsiderate. And so like those kind of changes could dramatically change, how society and how disease circulates in our community. And it would get rid of COVID and a lot of other issues that we have as a society. And it's all just unnecessary expenditure, unnecessary productivity losses, absenteeism, all that stuff that gets worse than it needs to be, as long as somebody just takes a little bit more responsibility at some stage throughout that illness.
And I think in order to create that responsibility, it has to become the new norm, that it's really unacceptable to show up sick.
Which includes modeling from people at all levels, whether it's celebrities or politicians or medical professionals. Like it becomes this is the new norm. But, I think unfortunately our freedom is one of the greatest things about our country, but it's also one of our Achilles heels. Sort of people get to do kind of what they want to do. It gets hard when you get into these kind of public health measures. But we've done it. Think about it. Like you're driving at night and you come to a stop sign in the middle of nowhere, you still stop. Like there's no other cars around, but it's something you've gotten used to. We've agreed as a societal norm, partially because the law says to, but we just do it. And so there's certain things that, whether they're a law or not, that I hope that we may be able to just adapt as these are things we just do.
There are policy interventions for this. I mean, one of the reasons that some people come to work sick is because they don't get paid sick leave. And there is a policy solution for that problem that could be a legal legislative change.
Yeah, in my question I said, I think that there's this feeling of, once we have a vaccine, we can go back to, how the way things were. But also, to your point, we as a society might need to think about getting to a new and possibly better place, right? So kind of moving forward and creating a new and better normal.
I think one of the things that is likely to take a very long time to return to normal is the more we learn about the virus, the more we learn that super spreading events are really driving most of the cases, and especially when we see a big spike in cases in a particular place and time. And we know a little bit about the context of those super spreading events. They tend to be indoor, crowded environments where there are a lot of people over a long period of time, like church services and gyms and buses, long distance buses. And I think that very likely, if we can figure out more about why those super spreading events occur, that's a very good narrow target for public health intervention. And I think that the more we learn about that, I think that'll probably continue. Just preventing super spreading events by eliminating those high-risk kinds of environments.
You know, I've been thinking about how do you convince communities and individuals to comply and to self-police with potentially, you know, new rules or wearing masks for longer, right? And then kind of to Jim's point, you know, I'm curious if you all think that, you know, it's harder here in America because of sort of this built-in individualistic sort of character that, you know, is kind of ingrained here.
Well, I think the answers to some of to your first point, you know, about how do we get people to comply with things, I think it has to be systems level solutions. You know, it's much easier for somebody to comply with, say, spacing if there's a sign on the door that says no more than 3 people are allowed in this room, versus leaving it up to the individual to figure out, well, how can I figure out, you know, how many people should be in a room, for instance. The same thing, I think even people that don't want to wear a mask will wear it if they're going into a building and there's a sign that says masks required. So I think it's those kinds of nudges that will help people do the right thing. I think as a society, yes, I think it is a little bit like herding cats. We were talking to a group in Singapore about how they got COVID under control there, and they said, we just put a memo out. And I was like, well, that's great. I'd like to see that happen in this country. So I think it does depend a little bit on, you know, the amount of freedom that people are given. But I think that, you know, we can't really do this without buy-in from everybody. So I'm not necessarily in favor of saying that there has to be a giant mandate that comes out, but I think that engagement is key, and then making it easy for people to do the right thing.
One of the things some people are talking more and more about is incentivizing rather than punitive. You know, there's the punishment if you don't do something, but there's the incentivizing if you do something. And I think that some of these societal behavioral things, I think we could potentially do better if we could figure out ways to essentially give people incentives to do it. You know, people have proposed things like if you go to a big box store and you wear your mask, you get 1% off. You know, like little things like that can sort of help drive behaviors. You know, I think that the other is, you know, the American public wants explanations for why. You know, I don't think that we're a society that just does something because leadership says do it. I think we want to know why. And so I think that, you know, as my colleagues have said, like there needs to be better explanation and messaging about these things. But I think if you add those two things together, give people good reasons to do it, you know, you're protecting, you know, the fact that there's 47% of our country represents some kind of high risk population, and that most of us have some contact with those people, you know, knowing that we're then helping essentially protect our other loved ones is important. But if you add incentives to then have people do the right thing, you know, that sometimes can start to turn the conversation a little bit differently.
Anything else to add?
I was thinking about the, with respect to wearing masks, how it's framed as an issue of personal liberties. And I always think it's a little odd to me that in fact our liberties are being infringed by the virus itself, and that wearing masks and getting the virus under control would actually free us from some of the other restrictions that we've had. And so some of it I think is framing and maybe a little bit of explaining to the public why these public health measures are specifically necessary.
But think about this. So 3 months ago, would we have been at all comfortable being here and doing this in this kind of setting? Probably not. But we've learned enough and understand that we're distanced, we're in a, you know, safe, wide space, we're wearing masks, that we can be comfortable and still not quite be the way this probably would have been a year ago, where we would have been sitting right next to each other with no masks and all those kinds of things, but that this is a reasonable alternative for now, and we've discovered enough about this to understand, like, this is a reasonable way of doing this. Like, that's the kind of stuff that I think we need to just keep being creative and novel. And, you know, I think there's going to be extraordinary discoveries that come from this, whether they're related to air circulation or irradiation of air or ultraviolet light, or who knows what are the other things that will eventually be emerging from this that do allow us to start to have more of those things. But there's going to be a lot of stuff that sticks. I mean, telemedicine, you know, is clearly going to stick. You know, meetings by Zoom, Skype, Microsoft Teams, whatever your WebEx, whatever your platform is, like, there's going to be a lot less people getting on airplanes and going to meetings to rub elbows for a couple of days, because we can accomplish a lot of the same things in slightly different ways. There's going to be a lot less crowded office buildings because there's a lot of people that actually can function and work very nicely in an alternative framework. So I think there's a lot of different ways we can manage a lot of this in addition to hoping for a vaccine and coming up with better treatments.
Definitely. Well, thank you all for being here, and thanks to you, our viewers, for tuning in to Cap Times Idea Fest 2020.
Cap Times Idea Fest 2020 is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors. Presenting sponsor, the Burrish Group at UBS, a financial services firm with global access and a local focus to pursue what matters most for its clients. Major sponsors are HealthX Ventures, backing entrepreneurs who are creating value with digital health solutions. Exact Sciences, pursuing earlier detections and life-changing answers in the fight against cancer. Quartz, health plans built with you in mind. And Madison Gas and Electric, your community energy company whose goal is net zero carbon electricity by 2050. Co-sponsors are Epic Systems and the Godfrey Kahn Law Firm. Other sponsors are Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, Home Savings Bank, Unity Point Health Meritor, Cargo Coffee, and the Forward Theater Company. Media partners are the Wisconsin State Journal and Madison.com, WKOW Channel 27, and Hinckley Productions. Please consider becoming a Cap Times member. Learn more at membership.captimes.com.